Okay, so session two, API fundamentals. So this session is going to be a tad bit different in that not only are we just focusing on APIs, but we're going to go through some of the technical concepts that are used within API, using APIs. So again, it's nice for us to be able to utilize APIs to extract data. We're going to learn to effectively query databases by way of using APIs. And then, with that being said, it's important to understand the kind of responses we get back. So, we're going to make requests that are essentially queries and then be able to digest and parse the response, which is going to be in the form of a JSON. We're also going to do a lot of functions. Well, maybe four different functions, just so that we can get a, a, a grip on working with APIs outside of just making one simple request, ideally multiple requests, and what does that entail? Okay. So with that being said, we've seen an image like this already, but I just love seeing this again, because it really at the crux of it explains what's going on. So an API allows us to make requests and receive responses to some entity. More specifics, the server, which communicates with a database. But at the end of the day, it's just for us, the most basic definition is for us to make requests and receive responses. As throughout this presentation, or throughout this, presentation, we're going to see more complicated versions of this, which is nice, for us to get a better understanding of what's going on. So, I want to go into detail a little bit more, okay? Because I know when we first said application programming interface, what does that really mean? So on the first level, when we make a request, it's simply the client. Okay, the client talks to the API communicates with the server, and the server finally communicates back to the data, gets information, or tries to get into the database. Once that happens, the database, or at least, sorry, the server responds back to the client with you're getting some information, or some status of some sorts, and it's going to the API back to the client. And this image is nice, but what I wanted to do in order for us to get a better understanding is create a GIF that demonstrates this flow of logic. So this is what's really happening here. So this is mid-show. So this is the beginning right here. The client makes a request, hits the server queries the database. The server then communicates back to the client. This is ideal. This is an ideal situation in that there's no errors, there's no mishaps, and this is just the general idea of what's happening in terms of the API. So we ourselves creates the API to be able to interact with the server to then give us information. Which is quite cool. So when it comes to this entire process, I don't know if you can see this. I could have emphasized this more. It's the request, the response, the request, the response. And so going a little bit deeper when it comes to the request and response, we kind of already touched base on this a little bit, but the request is going to be in the form of a URL. Okay, you're going to have some endpoint, some base URL. That terminology is going to be emphasized again later. And then you're going to have your API key, okay? And then you're going to have parameters, depending on what you're searching for. The base URL is essentially the location where it's going to go. And then your API key is your permission, right? That can I come in? And then the parameters is what kind of information do you exactly want? What kind of information you want? And we can either do a get or a post, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But when it comes to a response, traditionally speaking, we're going to get a response that contains the data, the metadata, and status code. Status code is going to tell you what kind of whether it was a success or a failure, or what kind of failure. Metadata is the kind of information about the response, and then finally, the data that we're after, like temperature and artist, is what we're really trying to get access to. I do things kind of differently in the strange way. I think that understanding the JSON, the response, could really help understand how the data flows. So instead of just focusing first on the request, we're going to focus on the response, then the request. Okay, so let's talk more about JSONs. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, JavaScript Object Notation. And this GIF right here kind of just gives you a general status or general gist of what's happening. It gives you the status code. Status code 200 is good. It gives you metadata information about the actual data that you have access to, and then the actual data in and of itself. We're not going to spend too much. I want to talk about status codes for a little bit. This is me mentioning metadata because we have so much to go over. But really what we're after is just the data. And this is what I would call a JSON in that we have keys and values, okay, as I mentioned before. All right, so with that being said, when it comes to static codes, okay, 100 is just general information. 200 is huge. That's success. We've got in, or we're getting information that's ideal. A redirect is if you're changing screens, or if you're like going from one URL to another. You won't have to worry about that in this level of working with websites. 400 is like a 404 or 403 is a client error, some error on your end, whether you don't have permission or something along those matters. Or 500 is when the developer, something's wrong with their database or something's wrong with their server. So that's a way to look at it. Okay. Oh, that's not supposed to be there, but that's neither here nor there. So now that we've talked about the response, we can actually take a little bit of time and talk about the actual request. So this is where we are going to get a little bit into the CS element of it / data science. I mean, it is data science, but it's important to understand this idea of CRUD framework. CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. Okay, so these different verbs are what you could potentially do with regards to the RESTful API. Okay, it's a certain kind of API that allows you to do these four things. In terms of data science, we're going to primarily just be doing creating and reading, really just reading, getting the actual information. When you go on to Facebook or or LinkedIn or something, you interact with the website, and you have like your own page or whatever, and you like change information, delete information. Though that's an update, that's a delete. When you create a new post, that's you creating a post. So these are the methods that you can do, or these are the methods that are being done when you're interacting with said websites, which is really nice and cool. But as you can imagine, as a data scientist, your primary responsibility is to read. It makes sense to get the data, right? To retrieve it. Well, that's cool. But at the same time, whenever you modify the state of a database, you have to create something, and that's when we'll potentially be doing a post. With regards to the APIs that we've interacted with or that we're going to interact with, you're not going to do a post here. You're just not going to. You're not going to do a post. But when I would interact with the Spotify data API, you'd have to do a post. I used to wonder, why am I doing a post? Why I'm getting information is because you're changing the status of your database. You're changing the status of your database because you're now having permission. So therefore, you're modifying the server. So therefore, it's a post request. I know I spoke a lot, but the bottom line is that we're going to be doing primarily get request. And so this is just an image, created just for us to have some further insight in terms of making these, or implementing these verbs. Okay. So with that being said, I want to just highlight just those two main ones, get and post. Let's do the get one first. And I created this GIF for us to see this a little bit deeper. Okay. This is the middle. Okay. So this is the client. That's the information being given back to the server. Okay, so the client makes a request. Okay, the server interacts with the database, gets the information, and then gives it back to the client. So that's the general gist on what's happening regarding a GET request. Okay. Some information. So the client constructs a request for a resource. Again, the client, when they make that request, it's going to be in the form of a URL. Utilizing the API token right within the URL. The API, validates it, or at least validates the request, and then communicates with the server to then gain access to the actual information from the database. And the server takes that information and brings it back to the client. Okay, so that's GET. However, POST is very similar. So POST is the client is giving the information to the server is storing it into the database, and then the server communicates back to the client that the information has been received. Okay, so that's how the system works of POST and or GET and POST. Okay, so that's the background. In terms of working with API keys, because we're going to be working with the climate data. There's another video that I'm going to create that will allow you the capacity to utilize your own API key. However, in this situation, we're just going to use the one provided. Okay, we're just going to use the one provided just to save time and headache. Okay, so this is information about getting an API key, but we're gonna go ahead and use the one that I've given you access to. Okay. So with that being said, I think this is a good spot for us to take a break and get those API keys set up, and we'll go from there. All right. See you in the next video.